My name's Rachael Roberts. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to all come into the room. Hi everyone coming in. Good morning. Hello and welcome if you're just coming into the room. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer for everybody to come in. So I can see the numbers are still going up. Okay, so good morning everyone. Can everyone hear and see me okay? Okay, I've got a yes. Oh, lots of yeses. Okay, good. Excellent. Now, Piotr, you've got an echo. Has anybody else got that? I think it should be okay. Nope. Okay. I think that might be on your end, Piotr. Sorry. Hi, Teresa. All right. Very nice to see you all here. Thank you for coming. My name is Rachael Roberts, as you can see on the screen. I'm a teacher trainer, and materials writer. And among other titles, I'm one of the authors of the new series from Pearson, High Note, which you can see here. And I will be showing you some examples from High Note in the talk. And today I'm going to be talking about growth mindset. I'm very interested in psychology, and as well as being a teacher trainer and writer and teacher, I'm also a qualified life coach, working with teachers and other educational professionals. And I think, the links between psychology and teaching are obvious. And so in this session, I'm going to be looking at how what we know about growth mindset can help us to help our students. So to start with then, okay, one of the very first things that children learn, okay, is how to walk. Have you ever seen a toddler learning to walk? What happens when a toddler is learning to walk? You can put your ideas in the chat box if you like. So what happens when a toddler is learning to walk? And what does that tell us about the process of learning when you're a young child? Yes, I've seen. Tries to keep balance. Yep. Yes, that's what I was thinking of, Annie. Yes, fall down. All right. It's hard. Right. So it does have stages. You're right. They keep stumbling, falling most of the time. Right. And what does that tell us about the process of learning? Okay, Alexandra says never give up. Okay, or Magdalena says tries numerous times and doesn't give up. All right, whatever happens, keeps trying. Right. Needs assistance, yes, but a lot of the time they're doing it on their own as well. But I think what is really interesting about when you observe young children learning to walk and indeed learning to talk, but the process of learning to walk requires a lot of falling down. Okay, you cannot learn to walk without falling over a lot. But we don't see young children just giving up and deciding that they're no good at walking and therefore they're not going to bother. They don't think, oh, I'm just not a natural walker. They just accept that falling down is part of the process. And while it does take some longer than others, there are differences in personality, they all learn to do it, right? And they put up with the falling over and they see it as part of the process. Teenagers, however, it's slightly different, right? So what happens between, being a toddler and being a teenager in terms of learning? Right? By the time that students become teenagers, they have often lost that sort of natural motivation that they had when they were toddlers or even at primary school. They've decided, what they're good at and what they're not good at. And so you'll hear them saying things like, oh, I can't do maths, or I'm not artistic, or so they've made these decisions. And they're also ever more conscious about looking stupid or making mistakes. Right. So in other words, they tend to have developed much more of a fixed mindset, which in fact will hold them back and which does limit their potential. So let's look in a bit more detail at what we mean by growth and fixed mindset. Okay, so I've got some sentences here, all right, A and B in each case. Just have a look at these and decide, what do you believe? Which of these statements do you relate to or believe the most? If you want to, you can put your answers in the chat box. So in each pair of sentences, would you choose A or B? I'll just give you a minute to look at them. Okay, so we've got some mixtures here. Just read it for yourself. There's no right or wrong, but let's see where you are. Do you choose more A or more B? Okay, all right, so the ones here that are in blue, so the A's, represent more of a growth mindset, and the B's represent more of a fixed mindset. Now, all of us, I would say, have some elements of fixed mindset. But in the basic difference, these terms were coined by Carol Dweck, right, in her book Mindset, which has been, as it says here, a 1 million copy bestseller. Right? And it's been very, very influential in terms of education and still is. So basically, if you have a fixed mindset, right, then you believe that your basic intelligence and your abilities are fixed and that you can't do anything much to change that. If you have a growth mindset, you understand that those basic abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort, through good teaching, and through persistence. So it doesn't mean that, everybody is the same. It doesn't mean that everybody can be Einstein, but everyone can get smarter and better at things if they work on it. Right? And so if you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset, this has a lot of knock-on effects in terms of how effective your learning is likely to be. So, for example, with challenges, if you have more of a fixed mindset, you may avoid any kind of challenge because you want to avoid looking stupid, because you feel that if you make mistakes, it's because you're sort of revealing your lack of knowledge. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you embrace a challenge as a way to kind of stretch yourself and to learn. Obstacles. Right. So if you come up against obstacles, if you have a fixed mindset, then you have a tendency to give up when you're faced with setbacks and obstacles, because you believe at some level that you've kind of gone as far as you can and that you're not going to be able to overcome them. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, then you persevere when you're faced with setbacks and obstacles. Somebody's asking for the slide of the book. I'll do it in a moment when I've gone through this. Okay, effort. Again, if you have a fixed mindset, then you tend to believe that if you have to try hard at something, it's because you're not very talented at it or not very clever. That if you were better or cleverer, then you wouldn't have to try hard. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you understand that putting in effort is what leads to success. All right. And then in terms of feedback, right, if you have a fixed mindset, then you will tend to ignore any negative feedback because it makes you feel stupid, even if that feedback is actually constructive or helpful. If you have a growth mindset, then that means that you see feedback as constructive feedback as something that will help you to improve, whether that's positive or negative. And finally, your attitude towards the success of others. If you have a fixed mindset and you see other people succeed, you might see that as a threat and it might make you feel more insecure. Whereas a growth mindset sees the success of others as inspirational and, something that you can learn from. Okay, so going back to this slide, because a few people were asking for it. Okay, so this is the book that kind of started the whole mindset revolution, if you like, and it was written by Carol S. Dweck, right? And as you can see, it's been a 1 million copy bestseller, so I thoroughly recommend reading it. Okay, so we've had a little look at kind of what mindset is. So why do students lose this growth mindset? So when they're little, when they're toddlers, when they're at primary school, they don't tend to have these beliefs that they can't do things or that they're stupid or, they just get on with it. So how do they lose that? Well, unfortunately, a lot of this is about what they hear around them. And so, it may be that they've had teachers who encourage that kind of fixed mindset by saying things like, I can't believe you got that wrong again, by sort of penalizing mistakes. You may also have parents who, in a very well-meaning way, reinforce a fixed mindset by saying things like, you're just like me, I don't have a maths brain either, so that they get to believe that you're either good at maths or you're not, for example. And some of it is simply that as we get older, we do become less we become more risk averse. We're more aware of what other people think of us, and we're more just generally more sensitive to that kind of thing. So it is natural, I think, that we are going to lose our growth mindset to a degree, but the more that we can hold on to that and develop a growth mindset, in fact, the better that we're likely to do. So how can we help our students then to develop more of a growth mindset, or to redevelop it, if you like, bearing in mind that this is something that they had in the first place? So very often this is about just changing perception, our students' perception and our own perception of how we learn. This is a meme which I see very often on social media, which I really like, because I think this encapsulates, the process of learning really nicely. So on the left, what people think success looks like, going from A to B, right? But what success actually looks like, all right? Lots of going around in circles, lots of going backwards or appearing to go backwards, but overall making progress. So if we can get students to understand that learning is not a linear process, and it's not something that happens without going backwards, making mistakes, having periods where we feel like we're not learning anything, sometimes, being criticized constructively, I hope. If we can get them to understand that, then we are doing a huge amount to help them to actually learn better. And, what we say to students really does matter, and the language that we use matters. So this is a classic point, all right, in terms of growth mindset, the importance of yet, all right. So it's not about, I can't do it. It's about you can't do it yet, all right. There's always that possibility that you can do it with a bit more time, a bit more effort, a bit more good teaching, whatever is needed. So it's a little word, this yet, but it's very important. We also need to think about how we praise our students. So, here are some examples of teacher praise. All right, now they're very well meant. And I'm sure that, students would love to hear all of these things, but they don't particularly encourage a growth mindset. Right? So, what might be the problem with saying these three things? In what ways might saying these not encourage growth mindset? If you've got any ideas, just pop them in the chat box. Okay, so Magdalena says labeling. Yes. All right, so you're really clever. That implies, doesn't it, that you're either clever or you're not. Right? And it's also likely to make the person that you've said that to feel that they don't want to say anything where they get the answer wrong, because then you won't think that they're clever anymore. Right? Yeah, okay. Lydia says the teacher did not refer to the details. Absolutely. So they don't really know what they did so well. Right. So this can indeed inhibit progress. Right. And Joanna says it doesn't encourage the students to work harder. All right, which is right. And Teresa says it implies no space for mistakes. It doesn't encourage students to make progress. Exactly. So, here are some alternatives, right, that we could use. Right. So, instead of saying you did brilliantly as usual, right, which just leaves them thinking, oh, fine, I don't need to do any work. You could say to them, great work. How could you increase the challenge next time? Instead of saying you're really clever, which just leaves them thinking, oh, well, that's nice, but I don't really want to say anything stupid now in case she stops thinking that. You could say you've done really well today because you kept going when you hit a problem. So somebody mentioned about being specific. Yeah, Lydia saying about referring to the details. You're telling them why they did well. And instead of just saying great answer, try and push them a bit further. Can you explain why that's right? Okay, so that's encouraging them, to learn more as well as praising them. So, two key things here to bear in mind, I think, when giving praise. Right. So, as well as not just praising the person and their level of intelligence, but praising what they did, say why something is good rather than just saying it's good, and ask follow-up questions as well. Okay, so Ximena, if I pronounce that right, says I often use option 3. I ask for justifications to make sure the student understands. Yes, absolutely. So that is, it's not just giving them praise, but it's also giving them an opportunity to learn even more, and indeed those around them, because the other students can learn from the explanation of why something's right. The other students are not going to learn anything from you saying, great answer. Okay. So these are the kinds of things, that we can do as teachers to encourage more of a growth mindset in our students. So research, sorry, I've just lost my thread then. Okay, yeah, so it's not about pleasing the teacher. Okay, so if we just say things like, oh, that's a great answer, you're really clever, you're brilliant, the students are focused on pleasing the teacher, whereas what we want is for them to be taking responsibility for their own learning and looking for opportunities to learn more. And research shows that the majority of success at school is not down to being naturally really academic. It's down to the learning strategies that students use and the motivation that they have. You don't have to be hugely academic to do well at school, because what you're being asked to do at that kind of level, doesn't require you to be a genius. It requires you to be motivated, to work hard, and to use good learning strategies. So even students who, perhaps did not do very well at primary school can still do really well at secondary school. And often they've already decided that they can't do well. And it's our job to show them that actually they don't need to shut down those options for them. During the teenage years, and indeed, going through to the mid to late 20s, the brain is developing at incredible speed. There's a lot of what's known as neural pruning going on. So pruning is kind of, in gardening, it's like when you cut back the plant so that it can grow more. And, the same thing's happening in the teenage brain. So a lot of grey matter is being cut back so that more can grow. Right? And that might sound bad, all right, but we need to do that in order to help the brain flourish, same as with the roses. Essentially, the brain is made up of millions of tiny cells called neurons, and learning is all about making connections between those neurons. And every time you reinforce a connection, it becomes stronger. So neuroscientists have a saying, what fires together, wires together. And so every time they make those connections, the connections become stronger. And we refer to these connections as neural pathways. So if you imagine like a pathway through the forest, if lots of people walk along that pathway regularly, it becomes very clear and we know exactly where to go. If people don't use the pathway, then it becomes overgrown. And it's exactly the same with the brain. So, if you make these connections often, the pathway becomes stronger. So what we're finding from neuroscience completely backs up Carol Dweck's theory of growth mindset, in that our intelligence and our abilities are definitely not fixed, and we can help students to, literally grow part of their brain. There was a very famous study done a few years ago with London taxi drivers. And London taxi drivers, not Uber drivers, but proper London taxi drivers, have to do a test called the knowledge, and they have to memorize all the routes through London. And it's quite a big task. And they took scans of these taxi drivers' brains before and after they studied for the knowledge, and they found that the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain associated with memory, had actually got bigger. So our brains are definitely plastic well into adulthood. These taxi drivers were not teenagers, but even more so when you're teenagers, and you absolutely can affect the development of the brain and therefore of intelligence. So, there is every reason to say that intelligence is not fixed. So, okay, having said all of that, what about some practical ways then to build growth mindset in the classroom? So we've already talked about what we can do in terms of perception and in terms of our attitude as teachers, and how, we encourage and praise students. So, what else can we do? Well, I think first of all, we need to encourage students to take more responsibility themselves for their learning. This needs to be a kind of gradual process, but there are things I think that we can do to nudge them along the way. So one way we can do this is to encourage them to, set themselves goals. So again, they're not learning in order to please you or even in order to please their parents, but they're taking more responsibility themselves. So this is a lesson from High Note 3, and it's a life skills lesson. And one of the features of High Note is that after every 2 units, we have a life skills lesson. And this one is on how to set goals, specifically SMART goals. SMART goals are those which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. In other words, you've kind of set yourself a time limit within which you're going to achieve that goal. So the students learn about setting goals. They analyse the experience of some other students and consider, what they could have done differently. So one of the key points here is that this is not about failing, but about taking responsibility for what happened and then learning from it. Or here's an example from High Note 4, and this is a lesson about emotional intelligence. So in this lesson, which is a listening lesson, the students learn about what emotional intelligence is, and then they put it into action by discussing how they could use what they've learned in dealing with these two hypothetical situations in exercise 9. So as you can see, these are the hypothetical situations, but they're quite typical situations that teenagers might have to deal with. So we're helping them to take more responsibility for their own learning. So I'm just looking at Gilina's comment. I like SMART goals in project management, but to do it in a single sentence is a challenge for students. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not quite. See if you can explain that to me a bit more, maybe if it's a question, because I don't quite follow what the question is there, and I'll come back to it. Right. Okay, so so I wanted to show you a little bit of research into how what we do in the classroom as teachers can affect students' growth mindset. So this is a piece of research into offering choices. So one way of helping students to become more autonomous, of course, is to offer them choices. And this piece of research showed that when elementary students in a Pittsburgh classroom were given the chance of deciding which tasks they would work on, the result was that the students did more tasks in less time. So if we can offer them more choice, then that's likely to help build their motivation as well as their autonomy. Or another example here, all right, if we don't spoon feed students, so I don't know if you understand that expression, but we spoon feed babies, they don't feed themselves, and we can also spoon feed students if we do everything for them. And this piece of research showed that when high school students were given the task of working on a project without giving them clear instructions, they had to kind of work things out for themselves. Actually, the result was that they put more time into the project, they produced better write-ups, and they remembered the material better than those who'd been told what to do. So obviously we don't want to leave our students completely confused, but I think if we can step back and try to give them more responsibility, often the results will turn out to be better. And finally, we can help our students, I think, by making sure that every student is really participating. Right? You could either video your class, or you could get an observer in to track what's happening, to analyze the interaction in your class, because when you're teaching, it's difficult to see that at the same time. But it's useful sometimes, I think, to have a view of who is actually participating and who isn't, because often it's the same students all the time who are answering the questions. Another thing that we can do is to increase wait time. Right? So wait time is the time that we wait after asking a question before we either accept an answer or we tell them the answer ourselves. So how long do you think is the average wait time for teachers between asking a question and accepting an answer or giving the answer themselves? Have a guess in seconds. How many seconds do you think teachers wait on average? Okay, we've got 30, 7, 15, 14, 30, 10, 5, 2, 10, 15, 15. Okay, well, some of you came closer than others, right? According to research, the average wait time is 1.5 seconds. All right, definitely not 30, all right, or anywhere near. So nobody got that low. 1.5 seconds. All right, yes, really. All right, yes, I think you did win actually, Lucina. All right, so I think this is partly because it's a bit awkward having silence in the classroom, and we naturally kind of want to fill it. Sometimes also teachers feel that they're putting their students on the spot if they wait. But actually, research shows that if we wait just 3 seconds, all right, so that's still not that long, that it has a huge impact on the quality of students' answers. And even more importantly, it has a huge impact on how many students participate, because some students just take that little bit longer to formulate their answer. Yes, exactly, as Katarzyna says, some students demand longer time to think. So some students need that little bit longer to formulate their answer or to get up the courage to offer it. Right? So really making an effort to just leave a bit longer and not allowing the same students to just jump in with the answers does have a huge impact. Obviously, other ways of getting students to participate, we can use more small groups and we can allocate specific roles within that group, so that different learners get to take on the role of leading the group, for example, or, managing the group so that everybody participates. And that takes us into the last point, talk to your learners about this issue and get them to take responsibility for participation. So again, rather than you telling them what to do, encouraging them to see that it's in their interests for everyone to participate. Okay, so getting every student to participate is one thing we can do. Another thing I think that can help to develop growth mindset is some understanding of metacognition. So metacognition simply means having some understanding of how we think, right, and indeed how we learn. So this is quite, we talked about this just now when I said about how, getting students to look at participation, getting students to really understand a bit more about the process of learning is definitely one way to help them to develop more responsibility and therefore more growth mindset. They need to take responsibility for the learning process if they're going to get better at it. So how can we do that? Okay, well, one thing that I think that we can do is to give students more planning time. So again, often we kind of jump into activities, but we know from research that giving students time to plan before they speak or write tends to result in better quality. Now, most of us do give time to plan before a writing activity. However, I think people less often do this in terms of a speaking activity, and yet research shows that students struggle to be able to get across their meaning and produce accurate language and think of something to say. So giving them some planning time helps to take some of that pressure off and results in a better result. And we know that writing is usually better if we've been through a drafting process as well. And equally, in maths, usually when teachers set maths work, they don't just want the answer, they want some evidence of how they got to the answer, some evidence of their working. And we can do the same thing, I think, with speaking and writing, so we can ask students, to show us the notes that they made and the drafts that they made before the writing activity, or the notes that they made before the speaking activity. And in that way, we're showing how we value the process and not just the product. So here's an example. This is from High Note 4, and this is an example of a speaking lesson. And I'm showing you this because this is an example of kind of preparation for speaking. So we don't just get them to tell a story immediately, but we take them through this process. So first of all, they listen to some examples of anecdotes, and then they look at how anecdotes are usually structured. So they have quite a clear kind of format, this kind of speech. So we usually kind of say that the anecdote's about to start. You know, that reminds me of a time when. We give background information, and as we tell the story, there's always a turning point. We have phrases throughout where we show their attitude towards it, and then we usually round it off by coming back to the present. You know, I'll never do that again, or I'll never forget that. Right. So we're giving them lots of preparation time here. Then they, in exercise 7, then they plan the anecdote, and then finally they tell it. Right. So this is an example of how you can help students to actually plan speaking. And this, again from High Note 4, is an example of how we can help students to plan writing. Now, this is probably, you know, more familiar for you because this is something that we tend to do more often. But again, you know, we're taking them through the structure of it, some of the language that they could use. So we're looking at verbs with prepositions here. We're getting them to work on it at sentence level, and then look at some possible introductions that they could use, which ones are better, and then finally writing. So again, we're focusing on the process and not just on the product. What else can we do? I think we know, and this is a quote from Scott Thornbury, we know that when learners repeat a task, even a relatively long time after its first performance, gains have been shown in both fluency and linguistic complexity. So getting students to do the same task again is something that we know can help them to get better. And teachers, I think, quite often avoid this because they feel they don't want to bore the students. And I understand that, but there are ways of doing it that keep it fresh. So, for example, if students are telling each other an anecdote, for example, if they tell it again, it will be much better. But they clearly don't want to tell it to the same person again because, you know, that would be boring and not something that we would ever do in real life. Well, most of us, some people do tell us the same anecdotes again and again, but most of us try not to. But if we just change the pairs, then it's still interesting and they will notice the improvement in terms of their fluency, and we've also seen that the language actually gets better as well. Another activity which works very nicely, I think, for developing this kind of fluency is called 432, and this is a speaking activity that Paul Nation created. And basically what you do is the students work in, the best way to do this actually is in a group of 4, and they talk to a partner for 4 minutes about a topic. And then they have to do the same topic again to a different partner within the group for 3 minutes. And then they have to do it again to a third partner for 2 minutes. And the time gets less each time, but they still manage to get across a similar amount of information because it becomes more polished each time. There's less hesitation and it's more fluent. So these are activities, you know, that work very well, I think, for helping students to learn about how the process can improve what they do. Okay, so I've got a quote here, and I'd just like you to guess, if you can, what word goes in the gap. What word would you put in this gap? Okay, repetition. I mean, there could be lots of things, but it is a quote, so I'm wondering if anybody has seen. A teacher is a gift to the class. Too right, absolutely. Smile, right? Creativity. Do you know, I agree with all of these, but none of them are from the original quote. Question, that's closer, Katarzyna. Humour. Yeah, well, I have to say I agree with all of your suggestions. patience, optimism, kindness, freedom, lovely. But the answer actually is a mistake. Right. So Caleb Gattegno was the originator of the silent way, which is a way of teaching which involved the teacher saying very little and kind of getting lots out of the class. And this quote is, yes, a mistake is a gift to the class. And I love this quote because it shows us, what we talked about at the beginning with the toddler falling over and over. That's how you learn. You learn through making mistakes. And if we're trying to avoid mistakes because we feel that they make us look stupid, then we're not going to be able to learn. Yes, there's no progress without mistakes. Exactly. So this is a really important quote, I think. And I think focusing, changing students' mindset about mistakes, and maybe ours too, is key. All right. Helping them to see a mistake as a learning opportunity. Right? So here's a lesson this is from High Note 4. And this is a lesson about people who have made mistakes and, what happened in the end and what they learnt from it. And I think this is quite a nice lesson for helping students, to see the benefit of making mistakes. So they listen to some stories about people who had, mistakes or setbacks and what happened and what they learnt from it. And then they end up by discussing, do you agree that a setback can sometimes be a blessing in disguise? This is some of the vocabulary from the lesson. Can you think of any famous people who messed up but learnt from the experience and made a success of their lives? And then there's the final quote. Anyone who never made a mistake never made anything new. All right. Yes, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. I mean, there are lots of examples of this, but this is about helping them to kind of recalibrate their mindset about mistakes. So some teachers actually get the students to keep mistake logs, or diaries, if you like. So they make a note after each lesson of what mistakes they made. What caused them to make the mistake? Was it a misunderstanding as to the grammar, or was it something, why did it happen? And this is not in a it shouldn't have happened way. This is a curious learning kind of approach. And what did you learn from the mistake? So Marta says, what can we do about their fear of making mistakes? Well, I think, we can encourage them to see that making mistakes can be a learning process, is a learning process. And something like a mistake log, can actually be very helpful. It's like domesticating a mistake, says Carolina. Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, feeling good about it. All right. Because actually, if you focus on those mistakes, you will learn from them much better because you will be more conscious of them in a good way and then see what you've learned from them. Some teachers even have like mistake quotas, like you haven't made enough mistakes. So the teacher might say, I expect you to make at least 3 mistakes. And if you haven't made any mistakes, then you need to ask me to make the work more challenging for you, because clearly it's not challenging enough if you're not making any mistakes. So this is another way that we can help them to feel, good about making mistakes and that it's a positive thing. And I think helping them to understand, that things being difficult can be a good thing. There's a sweet spot. We don't want students to find it so difficult that they give up. All right. But Elizabeth and Robert Bjork are big researchers in this idea of desirable difficulty. And so, what they say here is conditions of learning that make performance improve rapidly often fail to support long-term retention and transfer. So basically what they're saying is if you're learning something really, really quickly and easily, you're probably not going to retain it long-term or be able to use it. Whereas conditions that create challenges and slow the rate of apparent learning often optimize long-term retention and transfer. So what they found was that, when it was more difficult and challenging and seemed to go more slowly, you actually learned more and retained it for much longer. And I think if students can understand this, then that will help them to feel that when they're finding things difficult, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Right. So this is a method of revising for exams that a lot of students use, like highlighting key points. Right. Do you think that this is a good way of revising for an exam? What do you think? Is it good or not? And why not? Or why? Put your ideas in the chat box. Too many colours, says Nabila. Okay, yeah, too colourful. Well, it's partly the picture I could find. Okay, so it depends on the student. Well, that's certainly true. But let's go back to this slide. Right. So if you are highlighting things in a book, right, then you have this sense, right, that you're making good progress. And this is because the brain is going, oh, yes, I know this. I know this. Yes, I know that. Yes, I know that. Right. But it's not at all difficult and it's not at all challenging. And in fact, the research shows that highlighting in a book is not a very effective way of revising at all, because the brain tells itself, oh, yes, I know that. And if it knows it, then it doesn't need to bother trying to remember it. Like, what we want is something that makes the brain go, oh, I'm not sure if I do know this, because then it will work harder to retain it. Right? So testing yourself is a much, much better way of learning something than highlighting. Right? Making notes can be good too, but that's not as good as testing yourself. Right? So the best way to revise, according to research, is to read something or to make notes and then close the book and test yourself, because it's the process of testing, it's that struggling to remember that makes it stick in the brain. Not just kind of, making it easy for yourself. It's the being difficult that actually helps us to learn. And I think, recognizing that is part of resilience, if you like. So it's about, recognizing that going through struggling a bit and finding things difficult and finding things challenging is a good thing and not something that we should be avoiding at all. So this again is another life skills lesson. This is from level 4 of High Note. And it's a lesson about how to build resilience. So the sort of strategies, if you like, for dealing with difficulty and setbacks. So if you look at the life skills box, there are some strategies here, so, accept that difficult things happen, be determined, see a setback as an opportunity to learn, take care of yourself, be willing to ask for help. But this is really about helping students to get that growth mindset about life in general, not just about their studies. Okay, and then feedback. So we looked at the beginning at how students with a fixed mindset often struggle a bit with feedback because they see it as saying, that they're not necessarily very smart, whereas we actually have to help them to see that feedback is part of growth. And when giving feedback, I think these are some of the things that we need to think about. So first of all, I would say that feedback should not be too supportive. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be horrible to them, obviously, but again, if all you're doing is saying, oh, that's wonderful, that's marvelous, tick, 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 they're not going to learn anything from that. All right, so feedback needs to help challenge them in the same way. But you need to get the balance right, and it will vary from individual to individual. But as teachers, you're able to do that. Feedback should involve more work for the students than the teacher. Right? If you are spending hours giving them written feedback that they never look at, then it's not helping them to grow. So we need to find ways of giving feedback where they are doing more of the work. And finally, we need to remember that grades and feedback are not the same thing, right? So if it's been shown through research that when there is a grade, students generally take no notice at all of any feedback that goes with it. They're solely focused on the grade. So I would suggest, do one or the other. If you need to give them a grade, that's fine. Give them a grade. But if you want to give them feedback that they're going to learn from, then don't do that at the same time as the grade, right? Because they will only focus on the grade. So how can we help students to do more work with feedback than us? All right, well, this is an acronym, DIRT, which is used a lot in British schools. And it stands for Dedicated Independent Reflection Time. And it's basically time set aside in class to give students time to respond to the feedback rather than them just putting it straight into their bags. So here are some DIRT tasks. All right, so rewrite a paragraph of your work. Rewrite some of your long sentences, adding punctuation. These are aimed at British school kids, but you can see the ideas here. Look up 5 spellings you're not sure of, Okay, here are some other things that you could do, other DIRT activities, which are more aimed at English as a foreign language. So, target lists. So instead of giving individual learners feedback on their written work, which can take hours, you could make a list of, say, 10 targets that apply to many students in the class. So, for example, the use of articles, all right, if that's a problem for a lot of them. And then ask the students to choose some of these targets and to look at their work and improve it. So to improve the use of articles in their work, for example, and then hand it in again. Compare 2 pieces of work, all right? So we can get students to look at a piece of written work from the beginning of the academic year and a piece from now, and get them to compare them and find some ways, specific ways in which their writing has improved. Right? So again, that's about getting them to take responsibility. We can use peer assessment, but that can be problematic if a student's partner isn't as able as they are. So gallery critique, you pin up the pieces of writing anonymously, and other students have post-it notes, and they can write some feedback, which has to be specific, helpful, and kind. And they stick those onto the work. And in this way, the student gets a variety of feedback, and the teacher can, of course, add anything important that hasn't been said. Margin marking. So most teachers have used correction codes, which are good, but an alternative which encourages more independence and which takes less time for the teacher is to simply kind of mark in the margin, like maybe with a star or something, that there's a problem in that line, and get them to find out what the problem is. Dots is a similar technique, but this is something you can do in live marking, which is sort of marking in the class as you walk around and monitor. You can just dot any items that you see they've got wrong and get them to try to correct them themselves. And of course, we can also encourage students to give each other feedback. So this is another life skills lesson. This is from High Note 2, and it's about giving a presentation. And you'll notice that the students are also kind of taught how to give feedback on a presentation. So if you look at exercise 6, they're analysing the video of the presentation that they've seen. And then when they get to the life skills project at the end, they're encouraged to give each other feedback. So to sum up then, some key points about growth mindset to take away with you, if you like. So first of all, learning requires repetition, trial and error, and mistakes. All right, and we need to recognise that, and we need to help our students to recognise that. Difficulty can be desirable, as the Bjork said. So difficulty can be a good thing. Excuse me, I'm just losing my voice. Obviously, we need to get the balance right. It shouldn't be too difficult, but some level of challenge is important for learning. Remembering that it's about not I can't do it, but I can't do it yet. Praise needs to be very specific, not just, oh, that's wonderful or you're so clever, and related to effort, right, rather than ability. Autonomy and choice are vital because we want students to take responsibility for their own learning, which brings me to the last point. So if we teach them about the process of learning, that will help to give them more ownership. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you found that helpful. Are there any questions? We've got a couple of minutes. All right, so Beata says that sheds new light on formative assessment. Yes, I mean, this is essentially about a formative assessment as well. And I think the two things go together very nicely. So I'm just looking to see if there are any questions. Okay, great, that's lovely. Could you show the previous slide, please? Yes, I'll go back to that. What if students take the opportunity of making mistakes just to stay at the same level? Well, I think it's about getting them to, to learn from those mistakes. Obviously, if they are always making the same mistake again and again and again and again, then they're not learning from the mistake. So it's about helping them to learn from it. People are asking about access to the video. In fact, I don't know the answer to this question, but I should think it's very likely that you will be sent a recording, but I'm not 100% sure. Oh, there you go. Yes, so Pearson's saying the certificates and video will be sent to everybody who is subscribed. Right. Are there any specific time spans to do revisions? Off the top of my head, I couldn't give you any definite sort of figures, but if you look up spaced learning, there's been a lot of research into how often to kind of come back to do revision. So spaced learning is what you're looking for. Okay, I need to go now because my husband is going to be doing a PhD Viva online in a moment and we need the bandwidth. We're all doing lots of things online at the moment, but it's very lovely to be here and to talk to you, and thank you all very much.